Welcome to Pop Americana. I am your host, Ryan Ashley Wall. As you can see, we are a tad short-staffed tonight, so it'll be just me, and that's okay because I know Return of the King like the back of my hand. And of course, The Lord of the Rings Return of the King is the film we're talking about. It is part 2 of 4 of our coverage of Return of the King. We will be covering everything from Theoden's decision all the way to the chapter known as the Siege of Gondor, which in the Blu-ray and DVD and even VHS versions of this film, that is the halfway point, the breaking point where you would switch disc or cassette. And that seems appropriate for a halfway point for us here. So, without further ado, I am going to ask that you like, subscribe, and share this video to your friends. And of course, leave a comment. Feedback is appreciated. I am not opposed to feedback. Whatever you have to say. If you don't like the hat, you don't like the hat. Leave that in the comments. If you love the hat, tell me to keep the hat. All right, let's just get right into this then. This is your last and final spoiler warning. We are just going to head into this then. Okay, so where we left off, the beacon of Gondor was lit, and we had that great line delivered by Bernard Hill as King Theoden, and Rohan will answer. And man, then of course the Rohirrim theme just comes into blast there, and we have this cool scene with a bell being rung, and Eowyn announcing to all of Rohan to answer oaths to the king to join him in riding to war in service of Gondor, which is, again, big move coming from Theoden, who we had previously, on 2 occasions at least, heard disparaging Gondor for not aiding them. But Theoden is choosing to be the bigger man here, which is, of course, a great contrast to Denethor on the other side of this, on the other side of these beacons, I should say, who is very much not being the bigger man right now, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. But this little scene with Theoden and his people getting ready to ride to war for Gondor is a blood pumping scene. It's a hype scene. It's like I can't wait for this to come true. And as we're going to see in later scenes involving the Rohirrim, this time, because they're able to marshal their forces and prepare, they're a lot more equipped, and with Éomer's riders, as opposed to the Battle of Helm's Deep, where they were caught off guard and had to be reinforced by elves and then by Éomer at the end. So they're in a better position than they were, and that is not saying much, though, because the forces of Mordor are impossibly strong, and later on we'll have Theoden accepting as much, which is important to Theoden's character and important to this contrast I keep drawing between Denethor and Theoden. Both, again, fathers who have lost a son, who have impending war on their doorstep, both of whom are facing existential crisis in their kingdoms, and both of whom are going about it in completely different ways. And as you can see, Theoden here is rising to the challenge. Not only has he successfully defended his kingdom, but he is well on the way to defending his allies. And that's really cool. So even though this is mostly a hype scene to get us ready for the big battle coming later and positioning us and making sure that we know that Rohan is coming at some point, and there are other scenes that do some of the same things, it's still a good character moment for Theoden, who is just ready to go to war. Part of this in the extended edition is with Merry approaching King Theoden in much the same manner, if not quite as touchingly, as Pippin, and offering his services. Now, the cool thing here, of course, is that unlike Pippin, who does so out of a bit of guilt and a bit of duty, feeling like he owes something because of Boromir. Merry here is doing this just because, and he'll give voice to this throughout, he does not want to be left behind while his friends are at war and laying their lives down on the line. He would be ashamed to do that. And Theoden kind of misunderstands Merry and is like, oh, isn't this sweet? You know, and he names him a squire of Rohan, but he doesn't really seem fully sold on bringing Merry into battle. And of course, later on we'll get him saying that outright, but this is establishing a relationship between Merry and Theoden that I think is a bit touching, but not quite as rich as it is in the book. Here it's still important, and it still provides contrast because Theoden is touched by this in a way that Denethor is not. And speaking of which, let's switch over to Pippin's side of the story, because there we have Pippin swearing fealty to Gondor, and there's a great line with this oath at the end where let's see, Pippin says, "Here I swear fealty and service to Gondor, blah blah blah, until my lord release me or death take me." Yes. And Denethor says, "Nor shall I fail to reward it." You know, and he gives this very stern, you know, I'm going to repay you in kind for what you're doing, and it's very transactional. It's a lot more formal. It's a lot less warm than the swearing in of Merry as an esquire of Rohan. And Rohan is a bit of a lesser kingdom in this, but Theoden is proving to be a greater man in that respect, in treating Merry with much more warmth and kindness, if not the same dignity, because I will say one thing that Denethor is doing here for Pippin is treating this very seriously, like he would anyone else. Which is not to say great, because he doesn't treat anyone else great either. Not even his own son, of course, which we sort of get to here in a minute. But yeah, it's neat seeing Pippin sworn into service right after seeing Merry sworn into service, and how different they are. And again, it goes to this constant contrast between Theoden and Denethor, which you might not notice if you're not looking for. And I'm going to keep bringing up the similarities because I think it's important to the themes of these films, which are in part about dealing with despair. Because so much of what happens in Lord of the Rings is there is no foreseeable hope, or as Gandalf said, it's just a fool's hope. And Denethor and Theoden contrast the possible responses to that maybe better than anyone. You know, perhaps Frodo, Gollum, and Sam hold up that side really well. But I think the repeated contrast between Theoden and Denethor is one of the strongest in the series. So I'm going to keep harping on that. We also have, moving into the next part, we have Osgiliath falling for sure. We touched on this last time. The Nazgûl show up, and the fighting there becomes a rout. Like, there is no victory for Gondor here, and Faramir decides to retreat and fall back to Minas Tirith, which is well delivered. Great yell from David Wenham portraying Faramir, and awesome effects with the Nazgûl sweeping in. More of them in the air together than we've seen previously. We've seen the Witch King. We have seen the one at Osgiliath. We've seen the one in Osgiliath in the Two Towers that Frodo nearly gave the ring to. We saw the one over the Dead Marshes in the Two Towers. But here we see like 4 or 5 Fell Beast riding Nazgul, harrying these forces and absolutely destroying Gondorian knights as they retreat, plowing into horses, picking men up and dropping them. It's a ugly scene, and it's very well shot, very good action. You know, you feel really bad for the horses, you know, even knowing that they didn't actually pick up and drop horses, but it looks so real that you can't help but go, oh man. And of course you feel for the people too. Obviously that's a bit more important, but nobody wants to see horses dropped. Not like that. But yeah, it's a good scene, and it transitions to something that makes it even better and more special, which I think is the arrival of Gandalf, who rides out, and such a good moment, such a good display of wizardry. We have the beautiful image of Gandalf, just one white rider on a white horse, and of course it's, you know, the Gondorian soldiers cry out, it is the White Rider, you know, it's awesome. Riding out onto the Pelennor field into the fray to try and meet with these retreating Gondorian knights led by Faramir, and this cool moment where he raises his staff and light just comes out of it in a cone and is frightening off the Nazgul here. It's a beautiful image, and Howard Shore's score just with these great high vocals happening at the same time. It's a moment of relief in the midst of retreat and terror and panic. It kind of harkens back to Pippin's conversation with Gandalf, where he says, you know, we have the White Rider, that's got to count for something. And Gandalf saying he doesn't really know about his abilities in the face of the Witch King of Angmar. But against these guys, against these other Nazgul who are not as high-ranked, they're not the leader of the Nazgul, they retreat. And part of that may just be that they feel like they'll get another shot anyway, so it's not that big a deal. But I do think it's a really powerful scene. It's nice. It's a display of magic that isn't just fireballs, which we talked about. It's cool when it happens, but at the same time, most of the wizardry in Lord of the Rings is more subtle. Because, after all, wizards are subtle and quick to anger. The retreating Gondorians are hastened to the gate. Beautiful gate. Weta Workshop did a fantastic job on the gate of Minas Tirith. If you get the chance, just pause it. Look at this gate. It's ornately carved, and it's just fantastic. And James sort of talked about this moment. I might have contributed, I'm not sure. But where Faramir sees Pippin with Gandalf, and Gandalf says, you know, this is not the first halfling to have crossed your path. And Faramir confirms that he has seen Frodo and Sam, and that he's going to the pass of Cirith Ungol, which is nice foreshadowing because Frodo and Sam are about to be at Cirith Ungol. And yeah, that is it didn't look good, Gandalf's reaction to it. And Pippin, there's a great bit of acting where Pippin's like, he's seen Frodo and Sam, and looks up with glee at Gandalf, and, you know, Gandalf is just kind of like hungry for information. And when he says that bit about the pass of Cirith Ungol, Pippin is just like, oh, Gandalf doesn't like this, so now I don't like it. You know, it takes a more serious tone, because Pippin is a chipper guy. He doesn't want to hear about Frodo and Sam being in peril. He's happy to hear that they've been spotted and seem to be okay. But this is the last point of contact they will have until Mount Doom. So, until after Mount Doom, really. So this is the only bit of information they have to go off of. The last time anybody outside of the Fellowship, or anybody who could report to the Fellowship, saw Frodo and Sam was Faramir with them leaving Osgiliath for the pass of Cirith Ungol. And that transitions pretty well into the next scene, because Gandalf says, you know, tell me everything. And we cut away to this really cool scene. And by cool, I mean heartbreaking scene where Denethor is really, really on Faramir's case for having sent the Ring of Mordor to... the Ring of Power to Mordor in what he says, and I quote, is the hands of a witless halfling, which is just brutal and rude given that he just swore one of those aforementioned halflings into his service, which tells you how much he thinks of Pippin. It's a really, really rude, horrifying comment to be coming from Denethor at this moment, and showcases his just genuinely bad character. In addition to that, he's being really hard on Faramir about it, and Faramir, for his part, I believe it's an extended-only line where he quotes his line from the book, which was in the Two Towers in the book, where he says, "I would not bring the ring to Gondor and I would not use it if she were failing and I alone could save her," which is pretty darn wise of Faramir, and again is, from a movie perspective, reminding us of what the threat of the ring is, its corrupting influence, and why we can't use it. And we have to understand too, being a film trilogy released a year apart, you do kind of occasionally need to beat that drum. If you're watching these back to back to back to back, it might feel like maybe they're beating that drum a few too many times. I don't feel like it is, but I could understand somebody feeling that way. But you got to understand, these were released a year apart, and it even so, in a normal narrative context, you do have to occasionally remind people of the stakes and why they're doing what they're doing, because there's a lot of moving pieces here, and it could be easy to sweep away the significance of the ring, its corrupting influence, even though we're seeing it in real time. We're seeing it on the small scale, and Faramir's basically saying if it had come here, it would be on a large scale. It would be unlike anything you've ever seen. It would take away everything you loved about your son. And in a heartbreaking moment, Boromir appears in front of Faramir to the eyes of Denethor, which is just sad. It's really, really sad. But yeah, the way that Denethor treats Faramir in contrast to Boromir, who we only really saw that interaction between Boromir and Denethor in the Two Towers Extended Edition, and again, even here in Return of the King, I'm finding reasons why that scene should not have been cut in the theatrical cut. I think it was more important than was thought at the time. But even so, even without that, Denethor is sufficiently rude and sufficiently fawning over Boromir, and by contrast, petty and wicked to Faramir, that we understand that there's a difference between the way he treats his two sons. And it's a stark difference. It's not the kind of difference that covers personality. It's the kind of difference that is showing clear, yucky favoritism from just a very abusive, terrible father. And again, keeping in mind that contrast between Denethor and Theoden, Theoden in Rohan has lost his son and only heir. His only heir surviving at this time is his nephew and his niece, Éomer and Eowyn. And while Theoden is mourning the death of his son, he is constantly looking out for Eowyn and constantly promoting Éomer, and is treating them like a father. And in the Two Towers, for his time that he was possessed, he regret the way he treated Eowyn, saying, she was doomed to wait upon an old man who should have loved her as a father. And we see in the Two Towers, after his possession is over, and throughout Return of the King, him constantly treating Eowyn as if she were his daughter. And that's touching and fantastic, but also speaks to Theoden's general character, who is treating these people who, yes, they're blood, yes, they're family, but they are niece and nephew, better than Denethor, who, mourning the death of his firstborn son, has a living son and is acting like his line has completely ended and that he has no one left and that he's completely alone. Woe is me. And didn't even want to light the beacons. Gandalf and Pippin had to force his hand there. It's yucky. Denethor is just horrible to Faramir. And it's inexcusable. Like, in the books, he's a little more sympathetic, but he's not a lot more sympathetic. He's still very, very awful to Faramir. And I can't remember when this scene comes in exactly, so I am going to just place it here, which is there's a little scene where Pippin is being given his uniform for the Tower Guard, and Faramir meets him. This is extended only. And he says, "I hear you're to join the Tower Guard," and Pippin is very happy to receive what he finds out through this conversation is Faramir's old uniform when he was a child. And it's a nice little moment between the two, and it goes back to Denethor referring to Faramir as a wizard's pupil because Gandalf and Pippin have this special connection, and now Pippin and Faramir have this special connection. And as additional layer, Pippin and Boromir had a special connection. So Faramir is exemplifying his brother and Gandalf in this role in a way. And Pippin sort of recognizes this because Faramir, reminiscing on Boromir, says that, he was always the strong one. And Pippin says, it's kind of funny because it's theme with these hobbits where Sam said, "You've shown your quality the very highest." Pippin says, "You have a strength too of a different kind." And man, that's going to reverberate throughout this film. Not just for Faramir here, but for the hobbits as well. For all four of the hobbits. Because this is, in essence, their point of view for this story. It's necessary to have these hobbits in all these places so that they can be spoken to and have things explained to without feeling like we have exposition that's clunky and unnatural. But more importantly, it's emphasizing the average, small, everyman, insignificant purpose and heightening that above, these generals and these kings and these princes and these stewards and these wizards. There's a strength of a different kind going on here with these hobbits, with Faramir versus Boromir, with Frodo and Sam even. I know we have beat the drum there too, where Sam is the obvious hero of this film. No question about it. But that doesn't mean Frodo isn't also a hero in this film. He has a strength too of a different kind. And that's as much as I can say about this scene without getting back to the Stairs of Cirith Ungol, which we talked about it last time. This is just a horrifying location. The space on the cliffs is incredibly claustrophobic. If you have a fear of heights, it's even worse because the amount of space on the cliff is not a lot, and the drop off is steep and sheer and long, and Minas Morgul's under it, so it's really, I can't think of a place worse to fall. Well, that's not true. There's one other place worse to fall, and it's in this film. So we'll get to that when we get to that. But more importantly here, we have this scene with Gollum and Gollum and Sam primarily, where Gollum is in their supplies, taking out the lambus bread, sprinkling the crumbs on Sam, and actually, does that happen here? Yes, it does. I think so. Yes, it does. Sorry. Sprinkles the crumbs on Sam's jacket and then throws away the rest, which I remember in the theaters at the time. I was livid. I was ready for Gollum to be dead at this point. I was mad beyond belief. And we'll get to that too, because there's a bit of comedy sprinkled out too, because Sam wakes up and is hostile to Gollum and, ask him where he's sneaking off to. And Gollum has this great line where he's very sarcastic and being like, I show you secret ways no one else could find, and you say sneak. Of course, Gollum speaks in the third person and says they, so it's a bit different, but I'm not James. I don't do a great Gollum. If we had him on here, we'd have him do it, but maybe later. But this setup, this does not happen in the book, but goodness gracious, it does really put you on Sam's side and really puts you firmly against Gollum. You hate to see it, because when Frodo wakes up, they want to eat to get moving for the day, and there's no lambus. And the discovery of the lambus being allegedly eaten is pretty rough, because Sam had earlier in the film alluded to the fact that he had rationed it for the return journey, and then Frodo says it's gone, all the lambus bread, and Sam turns to accuse Gollum, and Gollum, being just this master manipulator, which great performance from Andy Serkis, who does like skilled liar very well, with his oh no, I hate nasty elf bread, and Frodo buying into it, saying he doesn't eat it, and then the nail in Sam's coffin here, and the point where I remember just shaking with rage in the theater is when Gollum says, "Look, crumbs on his jacket. He took it." And Sam's explosive, violent reaction where he just starts beating into Gollum. Exactly the wrong thing to do. And he's just mad and wants to calm down and explain to Frodo he didn't need it. But Frodo sends him off. And it's a heartbreaking moment. And Sean Astin's acting here with the crying is... it's so hard to watch. As James pointed out last time, this is in a way the least fun leg of the journey. It's really, really rough. And I just got to hand it to Sean Astin and Andy Serkis in particular for their acting here. Elijah Wood's doing a great job too, but he has a lot less to do. And throughout the film, most of his work will be appearing miserable and sad and tired. It's not the entirety of it, but for a lot of this movie, that's where Frodo's at. So Elijah Wood is not having to do the same kind of dramatic work that Sean Astin and Andy Serkis are asked to do here, and they sell it. They sell it so well. You're just so mad at Gollum and so really sad and heartbroken for Sam. You don't want Sam to be sent home. You don't want Gollum sneaking off alone with Frodo, with whoever Hare is. I mean, I know who it is, and you watching this probably know who it is. But at the time, if you're watching this with fresh eyes and you haven't read the books, you have no idea what's coming next. You just know you don't like it. And it's compounding the frustration earlier of Sam having heard that Gollum intends to murder them, and that's just That ain't it, guys. That's just terrible. It's frustrating, and like James said, not the fun part of the journey. No fun is happening here. It's all engaging. It's not frustrating in the same way that something like Jar Jar Binks is, where you just hate the film for it. But it's really oppressive and really sad and really tense in a way that this film is about to just ratchet to 11. It's just really going to keep tightening on this tension. And we've just been having despicable person after despicable person. First, we have Denethor being an absolutely awful father. We have Gollum being a murderous sneak. We have Frodo not being a great friend in this moment, not trusting of Sam. And to be fair, Frodo has had one of his companions try to kill him over this thing and does not want Sam to be corrupted, and has butt heads with Sam a couple times and even drawn a sword on Sam once during this journey. So the most charitable read would be a small part of him doesn't want anything bad to happen to Sam by him being there. But the long and short of it is he was manipulated by Gollum, and he will have to atone for that later in ways he does not like. Back at Minas Tirith, we have a short scene where the guards at the gate are talking about how they've essentially been cut off, and they're not sure if Theoden and Rohan will come, and Gandalf says courage is the best defense now, which sounds like if you put it on a bumper sticker, you'd be like, oh, okay, that's a really cool line. But in context is a little bit depressing. Like, it is an uplifting statement and an uplifting sentiment in the sense that, courage is the best defense. I don't know any other way to restate that except, the best way to survive here from this situation, how dire as it is to continue persevering in courage. But in the context of the situation, it's a bit worse than that. It's more like you can't count on any material help coming. And remember, Gandalf did not get the "and Rohan will answer" scene like we did. Gandalf left there after Theoden had said, "Why should we ride to the aid of those who do not come to ours?" And Aragorn saying they must be warned. And so, for all Gandalf knows, nobody's coming. Now, Gandalf does allude that Aragorn has another way to go, and I think Gandalf does hope that Theoden's coming. I think he does feel like Theoden and Rohan are coming, but he doesn't know. And so courage is the best defense is like saying, don't count on help, buddy. What you have here, that's all you have to go on. And that's a little bit depressing. So remember that next time you watch it. It's not exactly a warm statement. Our next scene goes back to Faramir talking to Denethor again. And Denethor sort of talking about how the situation for defending against Mordor's onslaught is not ideal, and that Osgiliath is taken and should not be, that Gondor should hold Osgiliath against Mordor and protect that way. But Faramir is trying to warn him. No, you don't understand. Osgiliath is overrun. This is not good. And Denethor's not hearing it. He said, weren't you entrusted to protect it? And in a heartbreaking scene, Faramir asks if Denethor had wished that their places being Faramir and Boromir, had been exchanged. And Denethor confirms, yes, I wish that. which is a terrible thing for a father to say to a son, that I wish you were dead and your brother were here. And to that end, Faramir is sort of manipulated into this suicide mission. And again, we have to remember all the way back in the Two Towers Extended Edition, where we have that scene where Faramir is eager to prove himself to his father. If there's need to go to Rivendell, send me in his stead, talking about Boromir. And Denethor says, oh yes, a chance for Faramir, Captain of Gondor, to prove his quality. And he repeated that in the Two Towers when he encountered Frodo and Sam in the ring. And then Sam repeated it back to him, saying he does have the very highest quality. But here it comes crashing down after the revelation that his father wishes that he was dead and his brother was alive. And he says, since you were robbed of Boromir, I will do what I can in his stead. Even in all this, still reaching out to try and impress and win the affection of his father. And the line that hits me the most is if I should return, think better of me, father. Which is bad enough without Denethor adding, that will depend on the manner of your return. Again, we have, by contrast, in the Two Towers, Theoden lost his son in the midst of his, what would you call it? Possession. Yes, possession is the only word for it, really. And he's really beat up about it. But Theoden only had one son. Denethor here has two, and one is dead, and he's sending the other off to die. Pretty much knowingly. I mean, he may have simply underestimated Faramir to the point where he doesn't believe that the situation is as bad as it is. And maybe he's pushing his son towards actually doing the work, which I'm skeptical. But that's the most charitable possible read you could have of Denethor there, and it's not a good read. And my goodness, there's a haunting scene where the horses, Faramir and his crew, are up in armor and on these horses, marching out of Osgiliath, flowers along the roads, mothers and daughters, off to see their kids ride to war. And they know what Denethor does not, that these men are riding to their death, that this is not good, this is not going to end well, that they retreated for a good reason. And there's this fantastic exchange where Gandalf is pleading with Faramir not to go, and Faramir kind of wraps his grief over the situation in a sort of nationalism, I guess you could say, where he feels proud that he's doing this. He doesn't feel it in his voice. You can tell, like, he knows he's riding to his death, and that's not okay. It's really sad stuff. And it's punctuated by one of the finest scenes of the saga, I think. A really, really sad, haunting, blended scene where Denethor asks Pippin to sing for him. And the song is a variation of a song Bilbo sung in The Hobbit, and Frodo sang a version of it in Lord of the Rings. Not the films, but the book. But Billy Boyd here just sings such a haunting melody, and the visuals on top of it are top notch. This is a fantastic batting 1,000 direction from Peter Jackson. We have the music of Howard Shore subtly backing up the vocals of Billy Boyd, who really can sing. It's not just bar songs, but there's this beautiful haunting song. And the theme of it is sort of adventurous and sort of dark, which is actually sort of Frodo's corruption of Bilbo's story, which is, or Bilbo's song, which is how it went in the book. But being given to Pippin for this moment, I think, is really good and highlights the sacrifice that Faramir is making here. And it's interspersed with the knights riding out towards Osgiliath, knowing that the armies of Mordor are there to ambush and murder them. And Pippin singing to Denethor, who is just... We have alluded to it. It's here. It has come. The moment you've all been hating for. Denethor eating and grotesquely mutilating this tomato in the midst of this song. Just when you thought Denethor could not be more contemptible. It's not the abuse of his son. It's not the sending his son off to die. It's not the wanton disregard for the life of his people. It's not even the unwillingness and pride and arrogance that prevents him from lighting the beacons. It is what he does to this tomato that cements him as one of the worst antagonists in Lord of the Rings. It is the greatest food crime in the saga, maybe in cinema. But jokes aside, memery aside, like that tomato where John Noble is squishing into his mouth as Billy Boyd sings is grotesque when put next to his son out there getting ready to die. And when the song ends and cuts away to the sound of bow shot, and wisely they cut away, they don't even show it, but you just know. And the way Pippin kind of breaks into tears at the end of it, and Denethor's shocking indifference to everything. Heartbreaking, grotesque, blood boiling, all of it is there. It's just the worst. Denethor's the worst. We are going to be back with Rohan for the vast majority of this. And not just Rohan as a perspective, but Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli are part of this too. And we have this cool scene of Dunharrow, which fantastic. We've praised at length the sets and locations here. Dunharrow is just a continuation of that. What a fantastic setting. The waving walkway onto the cliffs where the all the tents, as James said in our Two Towers discussion, even the tents are Rohan tents. It just looks like a cool mountain part of Rohan where they gather troops, and it's fantastic. We have Theoden saying that they've assembled 6,000 spears, which is less than half of what he'd hoped for, which means he was hoping for 1,200 riders. Excuse me, 12,000 riders. I can do math, I promise. Which is way more than the paltry 300 they had at Helm's Deep. That was mostly peasantry. We're talking professional riders here. A real cavalry being formed. And him saying that's not enough. That's not good enough. And they don't have much hope for this, which we're going to get into with subsequent scenes. But gosh, it's cool to behold. The riding, the marshalling of forces here, the mustering of Rohan is good. It's just really good stuff. You can't help but feel like really pumped for what's coming next, and I like that a lot. But what's really important here is as everybody gets settled in, we have a couple things set up here that are going to become important. The first is the horses going crazy when they get near this pass in the mountains. They call it the Dimholt Road. which goes into the mountain, and they say that it's a place of death, that nobody goes there, that men who go in never return, and it's a horrifying place. And Eomer gives us that kind of history, and Carl Urban as Eomer, we haven't had much chance to talk about him. This is sort of the most we get of him because he was barely in the Two Towers. He had such a presence despite only being in like 2 parts of the Two Towers. Well, 3, I guess you could say. But here he's still doing great. We're going to see him a few times here. And we've seen him before in this film too, including at the beginning of this episode when he was announcing to Rohan that they were riding to war and really marshaling the forces at Edoras. But here explaining that the mountain pass is haunted and terrible and nobody should ever go there is setting up the paths of the dead for us. And we also, by having Theoden mention that he had less than half of what he had hoped for, we're setting up the fact that between Gondor and Rohan, there's not enough men to take care of this onslaught heading to Minas Tirith, which is important for... And I know I'm rocketing through this at breakneck pace. I don't have as much thought to bounce off of other people. I'm hoping to bring as not just summary, but really tying in thematic material as we go scene through scene here, and pointing out just moments of great production design and music and stuff, and acting as well. So I really hope I'm not just providing commentary here, but really enriching the scenes here. But the next scene we really have here, Aragorn is having visions of Arwen and walking down this beautiful, ornate marble room, and also being woken up at the same instant that he drops his gift from Arwen, the pendant, and it shatters as it hits the ground. And he wakes up drawing a blade, which I think is really cool bit of character detail. Like, this is how light of a sleeper he is. He's a ranger. He's kind of used to being out in the wild, and something waking you up in your sleep is probably trying to kill you. But it freaks out this poor messenger Rohirrim guy who's just kind of saying the king needs him. And he goes to the king's tent, and there's a cloaked figure. And Theoden takes his leave, and we have Hugo Weaving's Elrond at this Rohan camp, and he has brought with him Andúril, which we saw being reforged towards the beginning of this film. Andúril is one of my favorite, maybe my favorite, although I really, really do like Orcrist in the Hobbit films. Maybe my favorite sword in film. It's a beautiful, large sword, and it really suits Viggo Mortensen very well. But it's given the name Andúril, Flame of the West, which is a really cool title. And we think of it in terms of our world, whereas the West is like, not the Eastern Bloc, but the West, the United States, Florida, the United States, France, Germany, like the United Kingdom, Canada, we think of that as the West, but no, here they're talking about Numenor and the real legacy of men and Gondor as a whole, and it's a really cool callback, and it shows the line that was in all the trailers that I remember most of all, Elrond saying to Aragorn, put aside the ranger, become who you were born to be. We are witnessing in real time the return of the king, and Aragorn pulling that sword out and remarking, Sauron will not soon forget this sword. And the cool thing about it is, in the extended edition, the nightmare scene he just had is something he will do, which is using the Palantir to bait Sauron and actually using the sword he gets in this scene. So it's a neat little bit of, it's not really foreshadowing because you can only know it in hindsight, but it's just a neat little intertextual play. I really like to see stuff like that in films, and it's clever on rewatch. But Elrond, as Elrond does, is here not just to give the gift, and also says, "I come on behalf of one whom I love," talking about his daughter Arwen, and that's neat. We're seeing real fruit from better establishing that Elrond-Arwen father-daughter relationship taking place in this scene. Nice to see that happen. But he impresses upon Aragorn the thing that the audience has been repeatedly hit with. You need more men. There's not enough men here. You can't do it with Rohan. You can't do it with Gondor. And Aragorn said there are no other people to get. And Elrond said there are those who dwell in the mountain. And Aragorn sounds a little uneasy at this proposal. He knows... This is a good bit of detail, too. This good technique in film. Here we have two characters that know what each other is talking about. Elrond knows about these men, these oath breakers in the mountain who are cursed. Aragorn knows about those people in the mountain who are cursed. We, the audience, do not. So, what you could do, what a lesser filmmaker would do, is have somebody present who does know what's being talked about, who does not know what's being talked about, for them to talk to. Or you could do the really bad thing and have them talk like they don't know what this is about. But instead, there's a third option too, which is that you could have made it so that Aragorn had no idea what Elrond was talking about and Elrond could have explained it to him. But that's way, way worse than what we get, because the idea is, by Aragorn's reaction to the suggestion, we are supposed to, from the viewpoint of, we are obviously wanting to see what Elrond wants to see. We want to see Aragorn being the king he's meant to be. We want to see him leading. But when Aragorn's like, you would call upon them to fight, they're faithless, and accursed. And it's like, what does Aragorn know that we don't? That's a good way to keep the audience intrigued, by having them talk about it like human people do when they know things, and the audience is just sort of privy to this conversation. There's a bit of suspense building for us, not for the characters. They know what they're talking about. We don't. That's actually okay to do sometimes, especially since it's not going to be long before we have that payoff. It's pretty awesome. So, Aragorn leaves the tent and has resolved to take the paths of the dead in order to get more men, in the hopes of turning the tide. And one other thing that Elrond brought up is that there's another force of Sauron coming up from the coast, which Gandalf told Pippin about, and that would have to be stopped first and foremost for there to be any hope of victory. It doesn't do well to win the battle at Minas Tirith only for this coastal force to arrive and ruin that advantage. So we have this back-to-back character moments happening where Aragorn has decided to go alone and Gimli stops him. And what I've interpreted this whole time, where he says, "Not this time, Gimli." Gimli kind of looks down like, "Oh, okay." And Legolas comes in and says, "Have you learned nothing of the stubbornness of dwarves?" And Gimli reinforces him with, "You might as well face it, we're coming with you, laddie." It seems like before Legolas came and reinforced him, Gimli was going to let Aragorn go. That's how it feels to me And Legolas, by bringing up the stubbornness of dwarves, is like challenging, not in a rude way, but just like as a friend, challenging Gimli to step up here and be like, no, we're going with him. And Gimli's on board with that, which is a neat character moment. But also Eowyn catches them and wants to go along with them. And I can't remember the timing of this moment. So before I go into Eowyn Aragorn, I do want to address, I think it may have preceded this, which is Merry sharpening his sword. And, or no, not wanting to sharpen. He's getting fitted in his Rohirrim armor and practicing with his sword. And Eowyn says, well, we should go get it sharpened. And Eomer has this dialogue with Merry that I have an interpretation for as well, where he says, you shouldn't encourage him. And she shoots back with, you shouldn't doubt him. But this is one of those cool things, I think, where both Eowyn and Eomer both know they are not talking about Merry. They are talking about Eowyn. Eowyn is saying, you should not doubt him. What she's saying is, you should not doubt me. Eomer says, I do not doubt his heart, only the reach of his arm, which is a bit of a joke about Merry. But then he shifts into war being the province of men, as he puts it. And he looks her in the eye as he tells her, when the screaming starts, when the blood is, he'll run, and he's right to do so. He's trying to tell his sister, who he knows, stay away from this. It's not for you. I don't want you to have any part of it. We may be talking about Merry, but we are talking about you. I think Eomer is onto her and is trying to scare her into stepping away from this path. And anyway, all that to say, she confronts Aragorn on the way to the Paths of the Dead and asks to go with him. And it's clear to Aragorn now that she thinks she loves him. And Aragorn is saying, no, it is a shadow and a thought that you love. Which is interesting because it is a thought that she loves. She loves the idea of loving Aragorn. She loves the idea of having this valiant man that she gets to call her own and whom she can emulate. That's what she wants. But Aragorn is trying to let her know, no. This isn't for you. This isn't right. And he doesn't say he's spoken for really, because now he knows Elrond gave him an update on the status of Arwen, so he knows that Arwen has not ridden to the west. Arwen is here for him, and in this point, now he's able to fully rebuff Eowyn's advances, and that just cements her need to go to war, which is regrettable for a multitude of reasons, but also good in unexpected ways, which is probably a good thematic summary for a lot of Lord of the Rings. Leading on to this, we have Eowyn going back to Theoden. Actually, before that, there's a bit with Theoden and his men where they wonder why Aragorn is leaving on the eve of battle, and they say he leaves because he has no hope. And Theoden doesn't believe that even a little bit. Theoden says he leaves because he must. And there's this awesome exchange where it's sort of the opposite of what we saw in the Two Towers, where Theoden had said to Aragorn, what would you have me do? Look at my men. Their courage hangs by a thread. He says, if this is to be their end, I'll have them make such an end as to be worthy of remembrance. And this soldier says, we don't have enough to break the lines of Mordor. And he says, no, but we will meet them in battle nonetheless. So Theoden thinks this is hopeless. That it's not a winning battle. It's not going to go well, which we will contrast very soon with Denethor again. So keep an eye on that. But there's this touching scene between Theoden and Eowyn, where Theoden says, basically, I want you to take up my seat in the Golden Hall at Edoras, and if things go badly, long may you defend it. He's basically naming her a de facto heir. Like, if he and Eomer die, well, she's it. In the book, this is a bit different. And I actually, I love the movies in many respects. I agree with most of their adaptive choices. And I agree with it here, too, because it's personal. But it's a touching in a different way scene in the book where I think it might actually be in the Two Towers, but it's repeated here because of the scene in the Two Towers where he asks who we should leave in charge, and one of the captains says, we'll trust in the House of Eorl. And Theoden says, well, I'm going to war, and I can't spare Eomer. And he says, we didn't speak of Eomer. He says, we're talking about the Lady Eowyn. Like, the people wanted Eowyn to lead them, which is really touching. Not to her. She seems to take it for granted. But here they wisely move away from that because as grandiose and as cool as that is, here they make it personal. And there's this beautiful exchange with Theoden where he asks her to take up the seat in the Golden Hall and defend it if things go ill. And she, resigned with exhaustion and frustration, says, what other duty would you have me do? And he says, I would have you smile again, which it sounds like a let's dispense with the idea that this is somehow the equivalent of the modern, oh, you would be prettier if you smiled more kind of thing. That's not what's happening here. It's an uncle talking to his niece, echoing the sentiment he said earlier about in the Two Towers about, doomed to wait upon an old man who should have loved her like a father. He is loving her like a father here. He's saying, I would have you be happy again, that there would be no more despair for you. Like, she has lost her mother and her father and her cousin, maybe her uncle, maybe her brother. And he's saying, there's not a duty I would have for you. That's not the way I value you. I would have you be happy if I could. That is a touching moment from Theoden. It's really good stuff, and it will come back later. Most of what I'm talking about tonight is sort of set up for other things, but it is important to cover it because it's really going to be vital later, I think. Heavy stuff. Speaking of heavy stuff, let me just say I don't get a lot of opportunities to give Orlando Bloom a lot of love in these films, not because he's not good, but because Legolas' dialogue tends to be a bit summary based, orcs, a diversion, goblins, a scout, that's Legolas for a lot of these movies. But his entryway to the Dwimmerberg, to the Haunted Mountain, is so good. It's really, 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 really good. The poem about The Way is Shut, it was made by those who are dead and the dead keep it, and the really cool direction by Peter Jackson with the jilted camera angles and the weird horror type frightening way this whole thing is shot is just good stuff. I really, really like it. I will confess that the whole Pass of the Ordeal might be my least favorite stretch of Lord of the Rings. But least favorite doesn't mean much in this suck. I really love these films. So when I say it's my least favorite, and even then it only might be my least favorite, do not take that as unreserved criticism. Like, this is good stuff. Legolas's monologue leading up to this, well, it's a little bit dialogue, but leading into this is fantastic. It's shot perfectly, hauntingly delivered. It's good stuff. And there's a bit of good Gimli comedy coming this way too. So we get to the gates of the Dwemerberg, and the horses just aren't having it. And Aragorn, determined as ever, goes right in. Legolas right after him. Gimli has the famous, this is a sight unheard of. A dwarf or an elf go underground where a dwarf dare not. He says, I'll never hear the end of it, and goes in after them. Good stuff. The setup is great. The set design is great. Like the grayness, the flatness of that canyon. Like I said, the camera angles, the distortion on the lens for some of these effects is really good stuff. And once they get inside, it becomes dark and terrifying, really. And as an editorial decision, I'm going to go through the Pass of the Dead here and then get to the Siege of Gondor here in a minute. Because the Siege of Gondor is probably going to be the longest scene section of this episode. It's good stuff. I can't wait to get to it. So I'm going to just finish off the Pass of the Dead. So the party enters and they go in and it's dark. It's very much in line with all the horror stuff we've been talking about with Peter Jackson. Odd camera angles, interspersed with a lot of Gimli comedy with like ghostly hands reaching up and him trying to blow them away in the extended edition, or stomping on bones that are, or you hear a crunch and he looks down and finds out that it's just skulls, like the whole floor is skulls and they're cracking as he walks. It's a good comedic moment. A little goofy, not gonna lie, but not horrible. And the effects on these ghosts that are traveling with them are really good. It's very green and murky. It reminds me a lot of the effects on the ghost in the Dead Marshes. It's a very, very similar effect on these ghosts, but it's really good. I quite enjoy the effect. It really holds up today. You know, you wouldn't think it would. CGI ghost men from the 2000s. But it holds up really well. And I think the greatest part of this scene, the most memeable, if we're going to bring up the meme counter, is the actual encounter with the King of the Dead. And as much as I said this whole Pass of the Dead stretch might be my least favorite in the series, you can't fault this scene. Like, it's really, really good. The way the ghost army just kind of comes in, the way the King of the Dead gives back that monologue, the way it's shot, it was made by those who were dead, and the dead keep it. Oh, so good. And Legolas trying to in vain shoot an arrow through the head of the Ghost King, who's just like, what? What did you expect to happen? And Aragorn here, showing his first major claim to the throne of Gondor, which is huge. I think it's important that we get it here. The book Aragorn is much more gung-ho and straightforward and much more of a classical king character from the beginning. The films decided to create tension with that by making Aragorn a reluctant leader. And I think for the films, that is the right call. For the books, I actually really like book Aragorn. It's great. I think for the films, it was the right call. And the Paths of the Dead is a really good reason for it. Because if he had been proclaiming himself king this whole time, this whole Paths of the Dead side mission would feel like a side mission, and instead comes across as a rich character moment for Aragorn. So the films, by making Aragorn a reluctant king, have strengthened the Paths of the Dead, which could feel superfluous or tacked on or just a cool effect. And instead what they opt to do is, by making this about Aragorn claiming kingship over Gondor in desperation, in the need to defend Gondor, we have this remarkable moment. We get to show off Andúril too, because he was just given Andúril. It's going to be some time before we get to Gondor for Aragorn. The Siege of Gondor is going to be going on a long time before Aragorn gets there. So with him just now getting this sword, we need him to be able to do something with it. And the King of the Dead threatens to kill Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. And in one of the coolest moments ever, we have Aragorn blocking the sword from the King of the Dead, and then putting Andúril to his throat, and saying, because he said the line was broken, and Aragorn said it has been remade. And just, so good. Such a good character moment for Aragorn. So fundamentally badass. And just the richness of this moment cannot be understated. Or cannot be overstated, I should say. And it's good stuff. It's really, really, really good stuff. But Aragorn has his whole, fight for us and I will hold your oaths fulfilled moment. Is really, really good stuff, but they just kind of rebuff him. And the laugh for the King of the Dead is really great. And the extended edition does something really wild, really bonkers, which is to have an avalanche of skulls happen where the dead just kind of disappear without giving an answer. But Aragorn is trying to get them to come back, and they're not having it. Instead, they just get an avalanche of skulls, which presumably is the skulls of all the people that are there. But we're talking about an absolutely unreasonable number of skulls, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of skulls. Like, this mountain is just where they keep the dead, I guess, and they just collect the skulls for their avalanche trap, which is wild, wild, wild beyond belief. But they managed to escape and get out to the other side, and it was shot in the trailers, not really seen. Actually, I can't remember if it was in the theatrical or not. Either way, it was shot in the trailers where Aragorn, feeling like he's failed, sees the Corsair ships on the water and goes to his knees in despair. And just when he's about to freak out, the King of the Dead comes back out of the mountain, cool effect, and just says, "We fight." Which is a lot like the End Rohan will answer, because it just gets you pumped for what's coming next. It's good, good, good stuff. It's really good. Last thing before we get to the Siege of Gondor proper, back in Rohan, or in Dunharrow actually, they're riding out from Dunharrow, and Merry is rebuffed from going, where Theoden says, "None of my riders can bear you as a burden. It's a 3-day ride," which is just rude, especially since he made him an esquire of Rohan, and Eowyn tried to talk him up, and Éomer tried to talk him down. But it's rough. It's rough to see Merry shut down like that. But we get the shot of the Rohirrim leaving. It's good stuff. A lot of horses. Great production design. And Eowyn just being the best lieutenant you could have with his form up, move out, form up, move out. Like, Carl Urban is just so good at this stuff. But the important part that I did not want to skip out of this scene is that Eowyn, in disguise as a regular rider of Rohan, scoops up Merry and wants to ride with him. And another book to movie change. Merry is not aware that Eowyn is the one who's doing this until much later. But that's important setup, is that in this, Merry knows it's Eowyn, which is good because we've established a relationship between them, and we have established that both of them desperately want to ride out to war for the sake of their friends. And they share that in common and decide to go together in secret. It's a really cool moment. And so Rohan's off to Gondor, off to war. Speaking of Gondor, let me just say, the Siege of Gondor is probably my favorite chapter in the Lord of the Rings books. But the main reasons for that are not actually in the film chapter, The Siege of Gondor, but a lot of the build-up and tension and things about it are. I cannot overstate the sheer production value of The Siege of Gondor. It is fantastic. We have so many iconic moments. We have, first off, the army of Mordor arriving with those siege towers and the trolls drumming, Gothmog coming in. It's so good. It's fantastic setup. But it's presaged by the army approaching and one horseman coming back. It's not even on the horse. He's being dragged by the horse. Faramir comes back, shot up with arrows, unconscious, and brought up to the pinnacle of Minas Tirith where Denethor and Gandalf are and Pippin is. And he appears to be mortally wounded. Now, it could be that he could recover, but he needs medicine and medical attention. But Denethor, hearing and seeing the armies, seeing his son wounded in very similar fashion to Boromir, who was just shot up with arrows, so too Faramir is shot with arrows, not doing well, and Denethor cracks. He just breaks in this moment. Like, he is gone. He was not great before, but he's unhinged now. Seeing his son in the state he is just undoes him completely. And it's both sad and really annoying, especially since we're seeing again the contrast with Theoden, who has determined this is hopeless, we're all gonna die. We see Denethor reason that out on his face as this is happening because, like I said, Gothmog shows up with the army of Mordor. He has this great little speech, the fear, the city is rank with it, let us ease their pain, and says, release the prisoners. And then the catapults fire. Oh my gosh. First off, the guy who says catapults, the lieutenant to Gothmog, a friend of mine and I called him the Cat in the Hat orc because that skull on top of his head, he looks like Mike Myers' Cat in the Hat. Look it up. It's bizarre that we have the Cat in the Hat as lieutenant to Gothmog, but that's what it appears to be. And these catapults just drop heads, severed heads with helmets still on them of the men that were killed at Osgiliath, which is just not okay. There's a detail in the book that I love about this moment too, where it says, chance came that the heads would fall among those who knew them in life. And that's just, I can't even imagine. But that army is enormous, and that intimidation factor of just throwing the heads back in is disturbing in and of itself. It shows that they're not there to play, they're not there to besiege, they are there to murder every last man, woman, and child in much the same way as Isengard with Rohan. They're not after the crops and villages, they're there to destroy the people. And Denethor looks out on this army, and it's just army as far as the eye can see. What a shot, too, when the camera just pans up and you hear the chanting of the army and you see the battle formations out in the field. The music for this scene where Denethor is losing his mind, I mentioned, you see the moment where he's reasoning out that this is hopeless on his face. The music that accompanies that, the strings going up, the catapults firing and putting the heads in at the same time, and Denethor reasoning out that his line is ended. Theoden has deserted us. Rohan has betrayed... No, he says Rohan has deserted us. Theoden has betrayed me. And he snaps. And he says, abandon your post, flee for your lives. And this moment got a solid cheer in my showing of Return of the King, and I may have been among them when Gandalf smacks him in the head with the staff and eventually just knocks him clean out and says, prepare for battle. Cinema with a capital C and a trademark. Happy to see it. And then we have Gandalf taking control. There were soldiers retreating. Gandalf coming back down has them getting back to their post, and they follow him to his everlasting credit as a leader. They follow Gandalf. They get back up on the wall, and we have the cool line I quote it all the time: send those foul creatures back to the abyss. And one of my favorite details of the trebuchets of Minas Tirith firing back is that they're throwing chunks of the city. Like, they don't just have catapult rocks. It's like whatever they could find that has fallen off the city in disrepair is being shot off. And cool minor character moment where Gothmog happens to be the target of one of these things and moves last second to spit on it. And the comedic bit with the troll kind of looking like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. Exquisite. But we're ratcheting up all this tension. We have Faramir wounded. We have the heads being thrown in. We have siege towers on the way. But to cap all this off, the Nazgul descend. And I think this is new record for the most Nazgul in a single scenario on their fell beasts. They swoop in, and what a shot. One of my favorite shots in the film is that shot in the clouds following the Nazgul down into the city. They're destroying catapults and knocking men off the wall and picking men up and throwing them again. Such a cool shot. It holds up today. It shouldn't. Nothing about that sounds like it should hold up today, but it does. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. I stand by it. Wow. What a scene. And the screams of the Nazgul are such that Pippin's throwing off his helmet. Part of what makes this chapter so special to me in the book is all this happens here. And we don't get to it yet. But I just want to mention why this chapter is important to me in the book and the way it's portrayed in the film and how it complements that. Especially the music, I think, that I was talking about during Denethor's deliberation in addition to the initial stages of the siege. That's how that chapter feels. You're getting one awful bit of news after the next. You're getting the heads. You're getting the Denethor losing his mind. You're getting the despair. You're getting the Nazgul swooping down. In that chapter, you get as far as Grond breaching the gates. It's horrible the whole time. And it just ends with this great line about horns blowing wildly. And it ends with the line, Rohan had come at last, which is just enormous tension relief, because this entire chapter in the book is tension to the breaking point. And I love that the initial stages of this siege absolutely feel like that. They feel true to reading that chapter to me. It's translated to the screen beautifully. You're getting the personal side of it with Faramir and Denethor and Gandalf and Pippin. You're getting the hopelessness with the heads being thrown in. You're getting the overall competence of Mordor's forces with Gothmog. You're getting the siege towers approaching, which fantastic. Like, I didn't know siege towers were a thing until Lord of the Rings, right? Like, I confess, never heard of them, never seen them before. But these trolls pushing these towers, it feels inevitable. They feel invincible in a way the ladders at Helm's Deep did not. They get up there and they drop down these ramps and orcs just pour out of them. It's so hopeless. But there's a little bit of good in it too. There's this bit where Gandalf is fighting the initial waves that come in on the siege towers, and Pippin comes down in a daze, and he says they called us out to fight, and Gandalf has to dispatch 3 or 4 orcs right there in front of Pippin, and one of them is about to get Gandalf when Pippin draws his sword and stabs him, and Gandalf looks down at him, turns around to the orc that would have struck him down, and sees that he's dying, and Pippin pulls out the blade, and he says, "Guard of the citadel, indeed. Back up the hill quickly." Whereas Denethor is content to throw Pippin's life away, Gandalf is like, no. This is no place for a hobbit. And that just furthering that deeper connection between Gandalf and Pippin that James likes to talk about a lot. I like to talk about it too, because it is fantastic. But guys, all this hopelessness, all this terrible, the first level of the city has been breached by siege towers. We've got catapults firing in. Gothmog holding strong, still alive, commanding the forces of Mordor. We have the Nazgul harrying the forces, destroying the trebuchets and making mincemeat of the defenses. We have Faramir up there dying, and it's just awful. It's just a very, very bad place to be. And I feel bad leaving you with that, but I wanted to mention my love of the chapter because of the way it turns at the end. I just want you to know, it does get there. Horns do blow wildly. Rohan does come at last, and the tide does turn. So we're looking forward to that in the next episode. I really appreciate you watching. I hope this has been informative, insightful, and an all-around great look into the fourth. We're finishing up the first half now of The Lord of the Rings Return of the King. Next week, I hope to be joined by a fuller roster and to get good opinions and insights out of others. But for now, you'll just have to deal with me. On that note, if you would, please remember again to like and subscribe and share the video. Join us next week for part 3. Return of the King is huge. It's a fantastic film. We want to give it its due. We want to go scene by scene and really dig into these films. I hope I have facilitated that discussion very well for you. I hope that you can look at some of the things I noted here in terms of filmmaking technique and in terms of storytelling and really chew on it. I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to speak about this film, and I look forward to doing it again next week with a fuller panel. That being said, I really appreciate it. Like, subscribe, share. Join us next week, and bye.